This is Dr. Summer Reed, and I'm having an interesting conversation about several different topics with Mr. Chris. I'm going to let you complete your name.
Okay. My full name, broadly known, is Christopher Ninambe Kinsey Kamau.
He is 6'8".
Yeah.
He has a very interesting philosophy to life, and I suggest that you listen to this until the end because that is where the secret is. Mr. Kamau, how did you get your name?
My father was one of two gentlemen that made a very alarming discovery. What led to that was my history here locally in the Bay Area was my grandfather was the bad boy of 29 children out of New Orleans. And he made his way to the West Coast, and he became the single Negro that the Italian mafia dealt with in collecting the money for booze, broads, and betting in West Oakland and actually in San Francisco before the Bay Bridge was built. You had to catch a ferry. So he would go over and collect all the money there, then bring it over back to the East Bay, and then meet up, with the folks that would meet with him. And they only met with one person in Northern California, my grandfather. He took his money from his quote-unquote ill-gotten gains and sent his son to medical school. And my dad did 3 years of medical school before he dropped out because he wanted to be a crook like his father. But he wasn't a very good one like Malcolm Little, who became Malcolm X. He just wasn't, that wasn't what he was suited for. He did find his destiny, however, and that was in community service. He married a beautiful woman, and they opened up 17 rest homes in Los Angeles County. And his primary function was to find Black Panthers and Black Muslims and have them put in his facilities rather than put in state, county, and city facilities where they would be lobotomized by white, doctors. He was the grassroots advocate that had the Martin Luther King Jr. General Hospital built in 1968 in South Central Los Angeles. And during the course of its being open, it saved tens of thousands of lives. But he backed away from that project because he was a 4-time felon, and they told him that he could, his position on the board would mean that they would have a less chance of getting funding from white folks. So he said, okay, you could see the logic in that. But unfortunately, he was the only cat that had a purpose for the people to protect the interests of wellness and health care for our folk. So the poverty pimps got in, and it's now been shut down. Actually, they built a new one out of the ashes of the old, but I need to go down there and talk with Maxine Waters or Diane Watson or somebody and get the plaque that they put on the side of the building before they tear it down in his honor, because that's a family heirloom. But what came out of that was he started to look at how do we, looking at the pattern that the United States government had formed, he started really reading the Constitution of the United States and the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America, but he was reading it forensically like he had been trained to do, in medical school, which everything is based on the language Latin. And if you don't understand Latin, and the components, then you can't decipher what's really behind that. So he started looking at the concepts of the term when in the course of human events it becomes necessary to separate yourself from another politically, and then why they then set the premise for separating themselves from their king. Well, he was like, well, we're being ruled over, what would be the premise so we could separate ourselves and do that lawfully? So he started doing research, and that research led to him being introduced to Robert Decoy, the author of the Nigger Bible and Cold Black Preach and several other books at the time that were very popular. And they made an interesting discovery. That discovery was the name of our people, which we think is lost. It isn't lost. It's in fact being hidden from us by the United States, by the Vatican, and by the monarchies that are under the Vatican rule, so that they can steal our land, steal our resources, and steal our people for labor. And that situation, was the same as it was 400, 600 years ago for exactly the same reasons. The only difference is now we don't have chains on our feet, but we have shackles in so many other different ways, whether economically or emotionally or socially or educationally, you name it. I mean, every dichotomy in society, it's not a fair playing field. And we're not doing for self. Things that we do not build our infrastructure. It provides us no assets. We don't create our own industry. We get nothing in exchange for our massive purchasing power. It goes on and on and on.
Before we lost power, you were talking about Senegal.
Yeah. What came out of that research was my father was contacted by the president of Senegal, Leopold Senghor, and they became fast friends and very close allies. My father helped Senghor hone the premises that became what's now known as Negritude, or more popularly known as Black is Beautiful. And what's interesting about that is, like Einstein, after he built the atom bomb in the Manhattan Project, spent the rest of his life trying to figure out how to undo, what he had done. My father spent the rest of his life trying to figure out how to undo that thought concept, not of the is beautiful part, but the black part as an identifier is a misnomer of massive magnitude that we have no idea how important that particular factor is, because it leads directly to, when we know the truth, it leads directly to a knowledge of our own jurisdiction as a nation state, and then it leads to our freedom. And when I say freedom, let me give you four practical examples. Freedom from taxation of the United States of America. Freedom from police jurisdictions, being afraid when somebody, you driving and they pull up behind you and turn their lights on, driving while black. Or, getting pulled over and they pull you out the car and might shoot you or tase you, or whatever. Freedom from their court system, where all they really do is process us into their, forced labor situation, so that nowadays in 2018, 40% of all of the things that are made, the domestic gross national product, is actually performed by African American labor in the prison industrial complex. And yet these same brothers can't get a job out on the street until they suddenly qualify by getting picked up to get in the pen. So like we're in California. In California, they test third graders in math to specifically predict how many beds they're going to need in prisons in the future by the time that child is old enough to drive an automobile. So they have a plot and a plan, and that is to disenfranchise our children while they're in school, and then say, oh, well, we tried to teach them, but they too stupid, or they too arrogant, or they too institutionalized, or, they got a criminal mentality or predisposed, blah, 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 all that BS. And then those same children wind up out on the street, and they're easy prey to be recruited to either do or sell drugs. So the statistics are 80% of all of the inmates in the United States of America are African American, and yet we make up only 5% of the population. Here in California, we make up only 5%. We're 12%, of the U.S. population, 5% in California. And you can count the cities that, have any sizable amount of Negroes in it as a population on one hand. Oakland, Compton, Richmond. After that, it gets real, Stockton, and then pick one, and you done. So it's like, okay, what's that about? But 80% of all urban crime is done by African American youth. 80% of that is done, is drug related. 80% of that has a gun that's involved. So they know this, and in 1948, the U.S. Department of Labor had a very confidential report where they were outlining what the effects of redlining that had started in 1923, and then how they were moving forward, or what had moved forward in first making certain that through redlining, jobs in our communities were drying up, specifically for males. And then how the welfare system had, in the 60s, had come in and said, well, you can't have a male in the household if you want to get this money. So we all are familiar with the TV show Julia, where she was hiding her man from the social worker and, all that nonsense. But it was a concerted effort institutionally to break up the family unit so that we wouldn't be strong, much like we see with the NFL now. It's just, passed a ruling to tell these athletes, what they can do while on the job.
You were an athlete.
I was an athlete, but what's interesting is no one is saying, okay, like Kaepernick is suing for collusion, and he won't win that case because that case is based specifically on collusion. Has to be two people say, I'm not going to do this and I don't want you to do it either, and we form a pact. Well, if it's institutional racism, they all going to have the same position and ain't nobody got to say nothing. So they all just blackball dude and Eric Reed now, and they can't get a job even though they're better than half the other players that are out there playing last year and this year. So no one's looking at the institutional racism side of it, because they want to say, like white folks typically do, oh, I'm not racist. Oh, well, no.
Do you think you're a racist?
Well, let me give you a history of racism so that you know, because we're speaking English. And remember, I told you my father was a frenetic student of language. Racist originally meant to have a love for one's race.
Okay.
This is how it changed. Once upon a time, there were protests in the Deep South. And how those protests normally happened was there would be a meeting in the basement of a church for our folk in our communities. How they would keep the house Negroes out of the meeting they would say when you came to the door, how do you feel about your race? Or are you a racist? And if that person said something like, well, white folks gonna be all right. We ought to leave them alone. We can't be messing with them. Ain't no sense in poking the bear. They gonna come around. Everything gonna be all right. They told him, well, you know what? This is a meeting for a bake sale that we gonna have, and Sister Mary, she gonna take you in the kitchen and and get you some muffins, and this is boring. You don't want to be up in here with us. Okay? Now, they flipped the script like Truman flipped the script on the United States citizenry by changing the word freedoms, plural, to freedom. When you have freedoms, when that's mentioned and it's talked about taking something away, you have an idea, a concept that something specifically is being taken away. But with freedom, it becomes a generality, and you have no idea what exactly, in the context of freedom, is going to be missing. See the difference? Okay, so with racism, what they did was they said, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to make this, something that is egregious against another race. That's what a racist is. They didn't do that so that we could holler, or shout, and point the finger, you're a racist. They did it specifically so that that washed away that filter that we had, keeping the house Negro out of those church house meetings. And then those Negroes went into those meetings and came back out and told the white folks that was often, police sheriffs, politicals and whatnot that were captains of business, that were also members of the Ku Klux Klan, unbeknownst to them. And the result was...
Deep, I need some water. Go ahead.
Okay. The result was, that was when, they would go in and say, well, they in there stirring up some stuff. I don't want no trouble, but, all that, pat and turn type thing. And playing the step and fetching role. And the result was, that was day coincident when the bombings in the Deep South started happening in the late 40s, the early 50s, and through the 50s and into the 60s.
What can we do now to move ahead?
That's why I'm here. I'm here to get as many folks to tell it on the